Good morning. We're thrilled to see everyone here this morning. We've got a little bit of a late arriving crowd, but a great crowd. We appreciate so much the visitors in the audience. If you are visiting with us, you're honored guests. We'd ask you to stick around for a few moments later, get a chance to know some of the folks here. Thank you for being here. As we continue to announce, we are live streaming the services this morning. We have been for some time. We will continue that. We have people from all over the United States joining us this morning by remote connections. At the close of the announcements, I'll lead the first prayer. The Lord's Supper today will be led by Brother Jason Bruton. Brother Jaden Horn will lead our song service, and our message will come to us today from Brother Joey Davis, our gospel preacher here. We ask you on a prayer list. We'd ask you to please remember our shut-ins. Send cards, calls, visits as you can. It's good to know that Mark Waters is approximately 2/3 of the way through his cancer treatments. We continue to ask you to pray for him. Joey Cartmill continues to be in serious condition in the hospital. That's Linda Morrow's cousin. We'd ask you to please remember him. We have an update on Brian Haddock, which is Carla's cousin. He had a motorcycle accident several weeks ago. He had surgery this past week, but he is showing some improvement and does remain in the hospital. There's others in the bulletin. We'd ask you to please grab a bulletin electronically, or there's one on the table out front if you're visiting with us. Please see the prayer list there, and please continue to do so. Some up things we want to do, make you aware of. Some up things, changes. Can anybody read that besides Jay? That is a certificate of occupancy. We're official. We're only 15 months late, but we are official. The good news is there's a challenge in here for us. It says our capacity is 1,092. So we need to fill this building up. The good news is if we get limited to 25%, we got a big number to hit too, so we're in good shape. But the bottom line to it is we will get this framed. We'd have to have it posted inside the facility in case the fire marshal comes by, but we are official. We do have the certificate of occupancy at a point in time. We picked it up Friday afternoon. So. Oh yeah, he told us to send out a mass email to everybody we can meet here Sunday, today. I think they probably know we've been meeting without that, but anyway, they've been very kind about it. You do appreciate Matt Cox, the city official that we've been working with there. Upcoming events. This morning we're having worship service only. Tonight we'll come back at 5 o'clock for Bible class. The Bible class will meet here in the auditorium. Everyone will meet in the auditorium. It's the massive review for the quarterly finish. So everybody will be here in the auditorium. All right, Wednesday night we're going to come together here in the auditorium for a song and devotional period of time. That'll be laid out, and we'll have that here Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. August 30th, as well as September 2nd. We will come together. August 30th is the PM service. We're going to come together here in the auditorium, as well as that Wednesday night, and we're going to be viewing some of the PTP lessons. That is they've put that on virtual this year versus having it in site. A lot of folks in this congregation have had a chance to go to PTP in the past. We're going to take and have a segment, 2 studies from there. Next Sunday night after the PM services, we're going to come together in the fellowship hall for all those who would like to and celebrate the kids who have completed their cards and studied their cards and learned all the cards. And we're going to have another ice cream supper. We're encouraging homemade ice cream this time versus store-bought Bluebell. Don't hurt Bluebell's feelings, but homemade's better, I think. But anyway, we'll be doing that on Sunday night the 30th here at the fellowship hall. Upcoming baby showers. August 30, Kelsey and Addison will have one. That is a Sunday after Sunday AM services. There'll be a fellowship in the fellowship hall. There'll be a meal in whatever the ladies do at those things. They'll be doing that down there. On the 13th, which is also Sunday afternoon, that's when Kim and Kennedy will have their baby shower. And I'm predicting that we're going to have one in January also. Stay tuned. We'll tell you that in a little bit. September 6th, we're going to resume schedules. That'll be AM service, AM Bible class, PM worship, and then Wednesday night. So we're going to try that again, go back to our normal services. Sunday the 6th, we will continue to monitor the situation as leadership in the congregation, and if there's any adjustments to that, we'll let you know. But right now, we're targeting September 6th. On September 13th, and all these dates and everything will be in the bulletin. On September 13th, we'll have a shortened worship service that Sunday night, and we will have our next communication meeting with the elders and the deacons at that point. On September 20th, the elders and deacons and preacher will continue to have their monthly meeting. And on September 26th, which is a Saturday morning, we're going to take and have a working day outside, focusing on the outside of the building. Would ask you if you would please make plans to help with that as you can. Upcoming birthdays. Sammy Anderson and Richard Goodwin are today. Wes Mathis is on Monday. Alexander Workman and Phyllis is having theirs on Tuesday. Mac Tischler on Friday. And Anita Brown got another one coming up. Where are you at, Anita? Do you know you're going to have another birthday? Monday a week from now, August 31st. Saturday next week, this coming week, Kelly and Randy Beck will serve 23 years. Not serve, but they've been married 23 years. Floridian slip. They will be married 23 years as of Saturday. Rhonda and Dan Camlin on September 1st. Got married on opening day of dove season. Where you at, Dan? On purpose? All right. They'll be married 41 years. Some guidelines we have for the attendance here. We ask you to please wear a mask. If you're inside the auditorium, you can take them off when you're here in helping the song service or participating. If you're in the foyer, if you come in and leave the building, we'd ask you to please wear a mask. If you did not take your temperature when you came in, before you came in this morning, there are thermometers out in the foyer. Please feel free to use those as you need. Thank you for your diligence. Keep everybody safe there. If we'd ask you if you attend to the restroom, go to the restroom, please knock on the door, make sure that no one else in there. We'd ask one family at a time. I always enjoy, and it's with permission with Jason. Jason and I have traded out lately on who gets to make the announcements, and I asked permission to do this one today. I always enjoy the upcoming birth announcements. And for reasons that become obvious in just a moment, this is twice as fun. It brings twice as much joy to my heart. There are folks in this audience this morning who will become grandparents again on or about April 7th, which, by the way, is my son's birthday. Ain't that right, Max? Max and Nancy are going to be grandparents again. Thelma thought it was me. Didn't you, Thelma? Why it's twice as nice is because there's twins. And it's Brad and Jessica. Congratulations to them. They called last Sunday afternoon during the elders deacon meeting. Those who were in the meeting know I stepped out. That's what I was told. And I was told I could announce it this morning. I'm so proud. I've known Brad for about 30 years. And I'm so excited for this family. And Jessica went to school with our daughter a long time ago. So we've known her a long time. They've been married about 15 years. Congratulations to you. We're so proud for you and so proud of you. Let's have a word of prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, it's thanksgiving in our heart that we come before thee this morning. We're so thankful for the privilege that we brought us here today to join in this period of study, worship, and devotion to you. Father, we'd ask you, all things we do here, bring glory to thy name, and all do things done in accordance with thy word and thy will. Father, we're so thankful for all the families that are here, represented here this morning. We're so thankful for the news related to Brad and Jess. We're so thankful for all the recent births as well as those that are coming. But ask, Father, that thou would be with the mothers, expecting mothers, and we'd ask, Father, for health upon them during these difficult days that they've got ahead of them as far as the children, carrying the children. We ask, Father, that they would take and give them comfort in all that they do. Father, we'd ask you would help us focus upon the things of this world. We'd ask you to help us focus upon the things that Brother Joey has brought together for our edification this morning. We'd ask, Father, we'd ask you to help us to have the courage to take the message to this lost and dying world, for it's everlastingly too late. We'd ask, Father, guide us and keep us safe in all that we do. In thy son's name we pray. Amen.
Come ye that love the Lord. O thou fount of every blessing. Wondrous cross.
This time we'll partake of the Lord's Supper. If everybody would pull out their communion and peel off. If anybody's missing their communion or did not pick one up, there's people in the back that'd be happy to give you one. Just raise your hand. So when you have it out, go ahead and pull the clear plastic top off to reveal the bread there and have that ready. As Christians partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week all around the world today, they do what Christ told them to do when he said, "Remember me, remember my death," when he took of both the bread and the cup and had the Last Supper. And then Paul went on to tell the Corinthians that we proclaim his death until he comes again. So the purpose of the Lord's Supper is to both remember his death and to proclaim his death. And really to do that, we need to understand the significance of what Christ has done for us. And I think Romans 5 does a really good job of helping us to understand that. And reading Romans 5, verses 6 and following, it says, "For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Christ. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through his death, the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life." Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to approach your throne as the body of Christ here at Roanoke, remembering the death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We thank you for this bread which represents his perfect body upon the cross, sinless under the old law, which no other man could possibly do. We pray that as we partake of it, we do so in a manner that's pleasing in your sight. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. If everybody now would take their cup and pull back the foil on top. Now say a prayer for the fruit of the vine. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this cup, which represents the very blood that Christ shed upon the cross, that is able to wash away our sins and continues to do so. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this great sacrifice and love that you and your Son showed for us by making this sacrifice for us as sinners. We pray that we take of it in a manner that's pleasing in your sight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. If everybody would take the remnants of your Lord's Supper, put it in a plastic bag, zip it up, and if you would toss it in the trash can on the way out, it would be appreciated. The elders have set aside this time to give back for our contribution. There's a box out in the foyer that you can drop your contribution, as we will not be passing a plate at this time. This is also a important aspect of our worship to God is our giving, our contribution to him, and also remembering all the things that he blesses us with daily. Let's go to our Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the many blessings that you give us daily to sustain life. We are especially thankful that you have blessed us with this being born into a nation that is prosperous, and we are ever mindful of the prosperity that we have here. We pray that we use it in a way that glorifies you. We pray that whenever we can, we're able to help those who are in need around us and even beyond our borders. Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that you would also bless those in the world that are not as prosperous. We pray that whether it be through the gospel or through physical means, that the more prosperous are able to give to them or help them with, that we do so when we can. Dear Heavenly Father, we pray that as we give back, that you would bless the elders with wisdom and the use of these funds to help spread the gospel here locally and abroad. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Give me the Bible. Give
Cletus mentioned, we will have our final review for our Bible class curriculum this afternoon at 5. I would encourage us all to review our cards and prepare for that. Parents might make sure the children do that so that we can, and adults as well, so that we can get the most benefit from that regular activity that concludes our quarter of study. Incidentally, if